The letter hit the floor of the sheriff's office like a gunshot. Ruby Mercer stood in the doorway, her dark hair loose from its pins, her chest heaving with the kind of breathless fury that comes only when a person discovers the ground beneath their feet has never been solid at all. She had ridden hard from her family's ranch, 3 miles of dust and desperation, and she had not bothered to knock. "You knew," she said. Her voice was low, which made it more dangerous than if she had screamed. "You knew the whole time." Gilbert Haskins did not move from his chair behind the desk. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark eyes that carried the weight of too many years and too many things left unsaid. He looked at the letter on the floor, the letter she had found tucked beneath the floorboard of her dead father's study, and he did not deny it. That silence was its own kind of confession. "Ruby, do not say my name like that." She stepped into the office, her boots loud on the plank floor, and she pressed one hand flat on his desk and leaned toward him with eyes that were bright and dangerous with tears she refused to shed. 20 years, Gilbert. 20 years you have been walking around this valley, wearing that badge, tipping your hat to me at church, and you knew what my father did. You knew what happened to the Crane family. You knew my family's name should have been dragged through the mud of every street in this territory, and you said nothing. He finally looked up at her. His jaw was tight, a muscle working beneath the skin. "I said nothing because saying something would have destroyed you. That was not your decision to make." "No," he agreed quietly. "It was not, but I made it anyway." The clock on the wall ticked 5 full seconds before Ruby straightened, pressed her lips together, and said the thing she had ridden 3 miles to say. "I want to know everything, every single word of it. And then I want you to explain to me how a man who swore an oath to the law spent 20 years protecting a secret that broke that law into pieces." Gilbert Haskins stood up slowly, reached for his hat on the hook by the window, and then changed his mind and left it there. He looked at this woman he had watched grow from a serious-eyed girl of 10 into the most capable, most honest, most infuriatingly principled person he had ever known, and he felt the weight of 20 years pressing down on his chest like a stone. "Close the door," he said, "and sit down. This is going to take a while." It had started, as so many things in the Cimarron Valley did, with a dry summer and a desperate man. The year was 1873, and the valley was young. The town of Harlow's Creek had fewer than 300 souls then, pressed between the red clay bluffs to the east and the Cottonwood River to the west, and every one of those souls was fighting something: drought, debt, loneliness, or the particular kind of slow ruin that comes from being too proud to ask for help. The railroad had not yet arrived. The nearest federal marshal's office was 2 days' ride to the north. Law in the valley meant one man with a badge, and in 1873, that man was not Gilbert Haskins. That man was a sheriff named Cole Pruitt, who wore his authority like a coat that didn't fit him, and who kept his office funded by looking the other way on the right occasions. Gilbert Haskins was 22 years old that summer, newly hired as a deputy, and he was the kind of young man who still believed that right and wrong were separated by a clear and visible line. He would learn, that summer, that the line was rarely clear and almost never visible. Thomas Mercer, Ruby's father, had come to the valley 4 years before that with a wife, a daughter who was 6 years old and already too smart for her own good, and a past he had folded up neatly and pressed to the bottom of his saddlebag. He had built a cattle operation on the eastern slope of the valley, worked it honestly for 3 years, and in the 4th year, when the drought came and the cattle prices collapsed and the bank in Santa Fe called in his loan, he had made a choice. The Crane family owned the water rights to the southern creek. Their land sat between Thomas Mercer's range and the only reliable water source for 30 miles. Isaiah Crane was a fair man, hard but fair, and he had offered Thomas Mercer a partnership, equal shares of the water rights in exchange for a portion of Mercer's cattle. And Thomas Mercer had refused, because Thomas Mercer was also a proud man, and proud men sometimes confuse pride with principle. Instead, Thomas Mercer had done something that Gilbert Haskins, arriving at the Crane property on a still August morning with his hand on his holster and his stomach sinking, would spend 20 years trying to reconcile. Thomas Mercer had burned the Crane family out. Not literally. He was not a murderer, and Gilbert would spend years grateful for that one thin mercy. But he had paid 3 men to drive the Crane's cattle into the river gorge in the middle of the night, had forged a document with Sheriff Cole Prute's not entirely unwilling assistance that transferred the water rights to Mercer's name, and had left Isaiah Crane and his wife and their 2 sons standing in the summer heat with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a piece of paper that said they had sold what had been taken from them. The Cranes had left the valley that same week. Isaiah Crane had gone to the federal marshal, and the marshal had looked at the documents that bore Cole Prute's official seal and had ruled in Mercer's favor. The law had failed the Crane family the way the law often failed people in 1873, which was thoroughly and without apology. Gilbert had known. He had been there when Prute signed those documents. He had been 22 years old and brand new, and he had opened his mouth to say something, and Cole Prute had looked at him with flat gray eyes and said, "Deputy Haskins, your job is to keep the peace in this valley. The Cranes are leaving peacefully. That is the only thing that concerns you today." He had not spoken, and that silence had followed him for 20 years. Cole Prute had died of a fever in the winter of 1876, and the town council had offered Gilbert the sheriff's position, and he had taken it because the alternative was leaving, and if he left, there would be no one in this valley who knew what had been done and who might, in some unforeseeable future, be in a position to make it right. That was what he had told himself. It was partly true. The part he had not examined as carefully was that by 1876, Ruby Mercer was 9 years old, and she had a habit of sitting on the fence post outside her father's barn every morning to watch the sun come up. And she looked so much like her mother, who had died the previous winter, that the whole valley ached a little when they saw her. He had watched Ruby Mercer grow up. He had watched her take over the running of her father's ranch at 15, when Thomas Mercer's health began to fail, watched her learn cattle and weather and water and law and business the way other girls learned embroidery and piano. He had watched her build something real and solid out of what her father had left her, and the thing that kept him awake at night was the knowledge that everything she had built was standing on a foundation that had been laid in theft and cowardice. Thomas Mercer had died 2 years ago, in the spring of 1891. Ruby was 28 now, and the ranch was hers, and Gilbert was 44, and the secret had outlived the man who made it. He had decided, after Thomas died, that it was over. That whatever wrong had been done was buried with the man who had done it. That the Crane family was long gone, scattered to the winds of a country that was too large and too indifferent to keep track of individual injustices, and that no good would come of pulling the stone up from its resting place to let the dark things underneath see the light. He had almost convinced himself of this. And then, 6 weeks ago, a man had ridden into Harlow's Creek and taken a room at the Beaumont Hotel, and Gilbert had recognized him the way you recognize something from a dream, slowly, and then all at once. The man was Daniel Crane, Isaiah's eldest son, and he was 35 years old, and he had the same flat, patient eyes as his father, and he had not come to the valley for any reason that Gilbert could call comfortable. Daniel Crane had found something. Gilbert did not yet know what or how. But he had ridden out to the Crane family's old homestead, which had been part of Mercer's range for 20 years and was now technically Ruby's land. And he had spent 2 days walking the fences, and then he had hired a lawyer from Santa Fe, and the lawyer had requested a copy of the water rights documents from the county recorder's office. Gilbert had spent the past 6 weeks watching all of this and trying to decide what to do, and the letter beneath the floorboard of Thomas Mercer's study had made the decision for him in the worst possible way. Ruby had found it before Gilbert had found a way to tell her himself. "Your father wrote it to me," Gilbert said now, sitting across from Ruby in the small back room of his office, 2 cups of coffee growing cold between them on the table. About 3 months before he died. He said he wanted me to have it in case anything happened, in case it ever came to light. He said it was a full account of what he had done, signed in his hand, with enough detail to make it undeniable. Ruby was staring at the wall above his head. Her face had gone very still, the way faces go when a person is keeping a very careful grip on themselves. He was trying to use you, she said. He was trying to make you responsible for his secret. If it came out, you would be holding the document. You would be implicated. Yes. He was not protecting you. He was protecting himself. Even from the grave, he was protecting himself. Gilbert did not answer that, because the truth was that he had thought the same thing, and he had no defense to offer for a dead man he had never fully respected. "And now," Ruby said, and her voice cracked just slightly on the word, "there is a man in town who has come to prove what was done to his family." "Yes, and his family deserves that proof." "Yes," Gilbert said again, "they do." Ruby looked at him then directly, and he held her gaze the way he had always held it, steadily, without flinching, because she was not the kind of woman you could look away from, and because he had never been able to make himself stop looking at her. "You could have told me," she said. "At any point in the past 2 years since my father died, you could have told me. I know. Why didn't you?" He picked up his coffee cup, set it down again without drinking. The honest answer was sitting right there at the center of his chest, heavy and warm and terrifying, and he had been carrying it for so long that it had become part of his weight, indistinguishable from everything else he carried. "Because I was afraid," he said, "of what it would do to you, and of what it would do to what's between us." The room was very quiet. Outside, a wagon passed on the main street and a dog barked twice, and the wind moved through the gap under the door and stirred the dust on the floor. "What is between us?" Ruby asked softly. And Gilbert Haskins, who had kept secrets for 20 years and told truths when they cost him nothing, looked at Ruby Mercer and told her the truth that had cost him everything. "Everything I have," he said, "for longer than I want to say." Ruby stood up from her chair. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to him, looking out at the main street of Harlow's Creek, at the hardware store and the dry goods and the Beaumont Hotel with its peeling yellow paint, at the life she had built in this town and on this land, and she thought about foundations. She thought about how a building could stand for decades on a cracked foundation, and how the people inside it could live their whole lives without ever knowing the cracks were there, and how when you finally saw them, you couldn't unsee them. "I have to talk to him," she said, "to Daniel Crane. Ruby, he deserves the truth. Whatever it costs me, whatever it costs this ranch, whatever it costs the name my father left me, he deserves to hear it." She turned around. Her face was flushed and her eyes were bright, and she looked magnificent and heartbroken and furious all at once, and Gilbert wanted very much to go to her and hold her, and he stayed in his chair because he had not yet earned that. "I am going to talk to him today, and I am going to tell him everything I know, and you are going to help me figure out what he is legally owed. Ruby, if you do that, you could lose the water rights to the ranch. The southern pasture alone, I know what I could lose." Her chin came up. "Do you think I want to profit from what was stolen? Do you think I could live on that land knowing what I know and do nothing?" He was quiet for a moment, studying her. Then he said, "No, I never thought that for a second." She picked up her hat from the corner of the table where she had dropped it when she came in. "I need an hour to think, and then I need you to come with me to the Beaumont Hotel. I'll be there." She moved toward the door, and then she stopped, one hand on the frame, and she did not turn around when she spoke. "Gilbert, what you said about what's between us." He waited. "We are going to talk about that too, just not today." She left. He listened to her boots on the porch, and then the sound of her horse moving away, and he sat alone in the back room of his office, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was the particular sensation of a burden beginning, ever so slightly, to lift. Daniel Crane was not what Ruby had expected. She did not know what she had expected: anger, perhaps, or bitterness, or the cold efficiency of a man who had been nursing a grievance for 2 decades. What she found in the small sitting room of the Beaumont Hotel was a man who looked tired in the way that people look tired when they have been carrying something heavy for too long and have only recently set it down. He was 35, lean and weathered, with his father's eyes and a scar along his jaw that spoke of a life that had not been easy. He stood when Ruby and Gilbert entered, and he looked at them both without particular hostility, which was more than Ruby felt she deserved. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Sheriff." "Mr. Crane," Gilbert said. "This is Ruby Mercer. She came here because she has something to say to you, and I wanted to be present as a witness." Daniel Crane looked at Ruby carefully. "I have heard your family name in this valley before," he said, "though not always spoken kindly." "Sit down, please," Ruby said, "and let me tell you what I know." She told him everything. She did it the way she did everything, directly, without embellishment, without sparing herself. She told him what her father had done, what she had found in the letter, what she understood about the water rights and the forged documents, and the night his family's cattle had been driven into the gorge. She told him that she had not known, but that not knowing was not the same as not being responsible for the benefits she had received from what had been taken. She told him that she was sorry, not in the hollow, reflexive way people say it when they want the discomfort to end, but in the deep, considered way of someone who understands exactly what they are apologizing for. Daniel Crane listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at the window, and then he said, "My father never stopped believing he would see it made right. He died 8 years ago still believing that." "I know," Ruby said, "and I am sorry for that too." "The water rights," he said. "That is what I came for. Not your land, not your cattle, not your house. My father built that water system. He dug those channels by hand. The Southern Creek is what made this valley livable, and he built the infrastructure to use it, and it was taken from him." Ruby nodded. "The Southern water rights should be yours. I will sign them over. I have already spoken with my attorney in Santa Fe. I sent a wire this morning, and he is prepared to begin the transfer paperwork." Daniel Crane looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his tired eyes. "You did not have to do that," he said. "The law might have given me less, depending on how the documents were interpreted." "The law might have given you less," Ruby agreed. "I am not offering you what the law might give you. I am offering you what is right." He was quiet again. "Then there are 2 of us. My brother Samuel is still living. He has a family in Colorado. I know. My attorney will handle the transfer to both of you in equal shares. I will pay for the legal costs." Gilbert had not spoken throughout any of this. He sat in the corner chair with his hat balanced on his knee and his dark eyes moving between Ruby and Daniel Crane, and he felt something he recognized after a moment as pride, clear and simple and profound. Daniel Crane stood, and he extended his hand to Ruby, and she took it and shook it firmly. "Your father wronged my family," he said. "You are not your father." Ruby held his hand for a moment and then released it, and she said, "I will try to be worthy of that." They left the hotel in the long golden light of a late afternoon, and the street of Harlow's Creek was busy with the ordinary end-of-day business of a small frontier town, men heading to the saloon, women returning from the store, horses being watered at the trough outside the livery, and Ruby stood on the boardwalk for a moment and breathed in the dusty, mineral-sharp air and felt something loosen in her chest. Gilbert came to stand beside her. Close enough that their arms nearly touched, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling afternoon. He was looking at the street, not at her. "You know what you just agreed to costs you about 1/3 of your ranch's viability," he said quietly. "The southern pasture can still be grazed," she said. "I will just have to negotiate water access rather than owning it outright. It's manageable. You've already worked this out. I rode 3 miles to your office this morning. I had time to think on the way back." He turned to look at her then, and she turned to look at him, and they were standing very close together in the last light of the day, and 20 years of careful distance felt suddenly, uncomfortably thin. "I have been an idiot," he said conversationally, "for a very long time." "You made a mistake when you were 22 years old," she said, And then you spent 20 years trying to manage its consequences in the only way you could think of, which was not the right way but was not without some honest intention. You are not absolved, but you are not the villain of this story either. Who is the villain? My father and Cole Prout, both dead, so there is not much to be done about that. She looked away from him, back at the street. I am very angry with you. I know. I am also not sure I could have managed any of this today without knowing you were in the room. A pause. Ruby, I told you we would talk about the other thing. Not today. Not today, he agreed. They stood there in the cooling evening, shoulder to shoulder, watching Harlow's Creek move through the last hours of an ordinary day that had been anything but. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Ruby's life. She had always known exactly who she was, Thomas Mercer's daughter, the woman who kept the Eastern Ranch running, the person in the valley who people came to when they needed something done without sentiment interfering with sense. She had a reputation for iron practicality, which she had cultivated because it was useful, and because it kept people from looking too closely at the things she kept private. Now she felt as though the floor of herself had given way, and she was standing in a house whose structure she was only beginning to understand. Daniel Crane remained in town while the legal paperwork was being prepared. He was a quiet presence, not unfriendly, and he spent his mornings riding out to his family's old homestead and his afternoons in the hotel's small sitting room, writing letters to his brother in Colorado. Ruby saw him occasionally at the general store or at the church on Sundays, and they would nod at each other with the particular gravity of two people who have acknowledged something serious and are not sure what to do with each other now. Her attorney arrived from Santa Fe in early October, a brisk man named Hartwell who wore a suit that was too good for the dust of Harlow's Creek, and who spent 3 days going through documents with the methodical precision of someone who genuinely enjoyed this kind of untangling. The water rights transfer was legally complex because of the fraudulent original transfer, and Hartwell had to petition the county for a formal nullification of the 1873 documents before the legitimate transfer to the Crane brothers could be completed. Gilbert spent a great deal of time in the county record's office during those 3 days, pulling documents and verifying signatures, and providing his own sworn statement about what he had witnessed as a 22-year-old deputy. The statement cost him something. Ruby did not know exactly what, but she watched him come out of the record's office on the second afternoon, with his face set in the careful neutral expression he used when something had hit him harder than he wanted to show, and she fell into step beside him without being asked, and they walked the length of the main street together without speaking. When they reached the end of the boardwalk, he said, "I may face a review from the County Sheriff's Association for not having reported the misconduct in 1873. What would a review mean? Potentially nothing. The statute of limitations is long past, but my record would be noted, it would be known." She was quiet for a moment. "You could have not given the statement. Nobody could have compelled you to." "No, but you told the truth and you lost 1/3 of your water rights for it." "Seemed dishonest for me to hold mine back." Ruby looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, jaw set, hat pulled low against the October wind that came off the bluffs in the afternoon, and she thought about all the years she had known this man, known him as the solid, quiet constant of this valley, the presence that kept order not through force but through some quality of steadiness that people trusted without entirely understanding. And she thought about what it had cost him to carry something for 20 years that he could not put down. "Gilbert," she said. He looked at her. "Come to supper, tonight at the ranch." He studied her face. "Ruby, I make a very good venison stew, and I think it is time we talked about the other thing." Something moved across his face, careful and unguarded and surprised, and then he said, "What time?" 7. He was there at 10 minutes to 7, which told her something about him. He had changed his shirt and combed his hair, which told her something else. He stood at her door with his hat in his hands like a man who had ridden past this house 1,000 times and never come in through the front. Ruby fed him venison stew and cornbread and strong coffee, and they talked about the ranch and the cattle and the coming winter and Daniel Crane's plans for the water system, once the rights were legally transferred. And all of it was comfortable and ordinary, and underneath, it ran a current that they were both aware of and neither of them, yet quite ready to name. After supper, Ruby poured 2 glasses of the bourbon her father had kept in the cabinet by the window, and she sat across from Gilbert in the parlor and looked at him directly. "Tell me," she said, when did it change for you?" He turned the glass in his hands, looked at the amber liquid, looked at her. "When you were 10 years old," he said, "I thought you were the most serious child I had ever seen, and I thought you were going to grow up to be formidable. That is not an answer. I know." He set the glass down. "I was 35, you were 23. You had just negotiated a cattle contract with the Tolliver brothers that every rancher in the valley had been trying to close for 2 years, and you walked into the saloon, where the signing happened, because that's where the Tollivers like to conduct business. And you were wearing your mother's green dress and you had dust on your boots from riding in, and you sat down across from Marcus Tolliver and you said, 'Mr. Tolliver, I understand you like to make men wait. I am not a man and I have no interest in waiting.' And Marcus Tolliver laughed and signed the contract." Gilbert paused. "I was standing at the bar and I thought, I am in serious trouble." Ruby was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That was 5 years ago." "Yes, 5 years, Gilbert. You were my friend. Or whatever you call it when 2 people have always known each other, and there is respect between them and you want very much for it to remain intact. I did not want to damage it. And now you know the worst thing I have ever done, and the worst thing I ever failed to do, and you are still sitting across from me with a glass of bourbon. So I have less to protect." She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she rarely let herself look, taking in the lines at the corners of his eyes and the gray at his temples and the broad, capable hands wrapped around the glass, and the steadiness of him that had been the most consistent thing in her life since she was 10 years old, and she said, "I am furious with you. I know. And I have been in love with you for 4 years at least, possibly longer, and I have no idea what to do with either of those things at the same time." The room was very still. "For years," he said, "I have always had excellent taste and very poor timing." Something broke open in his face then, a careful crack in the composure he kept so well, and behind it was something warm and unguarded and young, absurdly young for a 44-year-old man, and Ruby felt her breath go shallow because she had not known he could look like that. "Ruby," he said, "I know. I have things to answer for. Yes, and you will. And it will not be comfortable, and you will not like all of it, and neither will I." She picked up her glass. "But I am 30 years old, Gilbert, and I have spent 10 years being more practical than anyone this valley has ever produced, and I am done being practical about this particular thing." He stood up from his chair and crossed the parlor in 3 steps, and then he was standing over her, and Ruby looked up at him, and he offered her his hand. She took it. He brought her to her feet and they stood together in the warm lamplight of the parlor, the woman who had kept this house running through every kind of difficulty, and the man who had kept this valley's most damaging secret, and he said, "I am sorry, for all of it, for not telling you, for not finding a way." "I know you are," she said. "I believe you." He was still holding her hand. His thumb moved across her knuckles, slow and careful, the way a person handles something they are afraid of breaking. "I am going to court you properly," he said, "if you will allow it." Ruby tilted her head. "You are asking my permission to court me." "I am asking it because you have spent your entire adult life having people make decisions about your life without asking what you want, and I intend to be different." She stared at him for a long moment. And then Ruby Mercer, who had not cried in front of another person since her mother died when she was 8 years old, felt her eyes fill. She blinked it away fiercely. "Yes," she said, her voice very even. "I will allow it." He smiled at her then, a real smile, not the measured, controlled expression she was used to from him in public, but something open and genuine that changed his whole face, and she thought, "There you are. There is the person who has been living behind all that careful quietness. There you are." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, formal and old-fashioned and somehow exactly right. And then he said good night and collected his hat and rode back into town. And Ruby stood in the doorway of her house and watched the darkness close over the shape of him and felt, for the first time in weeks, something that was adjacent to peace. November in the Cimarron Valley was cold and brilliant, the sky a hard, high blue and the cottonwoods along the river going gold and then bare. And Ruby threw herself into the work of preparing the ranch for winter with the focused intensity that had always been her armor against everything she did not want to think about too carefully. She hired 2 new hands to compensate for the loss of the southern pasture. She would need to manage her remaining water access more aggressively, which meant more labor-intensive rotation of the cattle herds. And she spent long mornings in the saddle and long evenings in her father's study going over the ranch's books and trying to make the numbers do what she needed them to do. Gilbert came to see her 3 times that week, which was more than he had ever come before. The first time was on a Tuesday evening, when he arrived with a hamper from the hotel dining room and a slightly sheepish expression, saying that he had noticed she had not come to the store in 3 days and was concerned she was not eating. Ruby accepted the hamper and invited him in, and did not bother pretending she was not pleased. The second time was Thursday afternoon, when he rode out without announcement and found her mending a fence on the north pasture in a cold wind with a wire stretcher, and a vocabulary of frustration that he had not previously heard from her. He dismounted without being asked, rolled up his sleeves, and helped her finish the fence without comment, and afterward they sat on the fence rail and drank cold coffee from her canteen and watched the light change on the bluffs, and it was the most comfortable Ruby had felt in anyone's company in as long as she could remember. The third time was Sunday, when he appeared at the gate with his hat in his hands and asked, with careful formality, if she would like to ride with him to the river lookout. "The river lookout," she repeated. "There is something I want to show you." She got her horse. The river lookout was a limestone shelf above the bend where the Cimarron turned south, high enough to see the whole sweep of the valley laid out below, the cottonwood corridor to the west, the red bluffs to the east, the patchwork of ranches and the small cluster of Harlow's Creek in the center, everything pale gold and brown and bone white in the November sun. Ruby had been up here many times, but she was still for a moment when she arrived, because the valley from above always looked different from the valley you lived in, smaller, more contained, more possible to understand. "My mother used to bring me up here," Gilbert said. He was standing at the edge of the shelf, hands in his pockets, looking out. "She said you could see the shape of a place better from a distance, that it was hard to understand something when you were standing in the middle of it." Ruby tied her horse and came to stand beside him. "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. She would have told me 20 years ago that there is no version of keeping a secret that ends without cost. That secrets collect interest, the way debt does. He glanced at her. "She would have told me to tell you. She would have been right." Yes. They stood there for a while in the cold, clean air, looking at the valley. Ruby could see from here the thin silver line of the southern creek and the channel that led to what had been the Crane water system, and it occurred to her with a small, private clarity that from up here the land did not know it had been the subject of a theft and a fraud and a 20-year secret. It was just land. It would be land long after everyone in the valley had become part of it. "My father," she said, "was not a good man. He was a complicated man. Do not defend him." "I am not defending him. I am saying that most people are not simply one thing, and your father was not simply one thing either." Gilbert was quiet for a moment. "He built that ranch out of nothing. He worked it honestly for 3 years before fear made him do something dishonest. He raised you alone after your mother died, and he let you run the operation your way from the time you were 15, which tells me he recognized what you were, even if he could not say it. He should have told me. He should have told me what he had done. Yes, he should have. He did not want me to think less of him." "No, which is," Ruby said, "also why you did not tell me." Gilbert was quiet. "Then not entirely, but partly. She turned to face him fully. He was a head taller than her, and the wind was moving his hair, and the afternoon light was doing something specific and unfair to the lines of his face, making him look both older and younger simultaneously, and Ruby thought, this is the man. This is the specific, particular, maddening good man. Gilbert, she said, stop managing this. He looked at her. What? You are doing it right now, being careful, measuring your words, deciding what to say and what to keep. She took a step closer. I am not a fence to be managed. I am not a secret to be protected. I am standing right in front of you, and I know everything there is to know, and I am asking you to stop being careful. Something broke open in his face again, the way it had in her parlor, and it was more complete this time, and she barely had time to register it before he reached for her, and she went to him without any of the hesitation she had been carrying for 4 years. And he held her with his arms around her, and his cheek against her hair, and the whole cold, bright width of the valley spread out below them. And Ruby closed her eyes and felt the thing she had been circling settle finally at the center of her chest like something coming home. I have been in love with you, he said quietly into her hair, for a very long time. I know, she said. I know you have. Ruby, Gilbert, be quiet. He laughed, which she had not expected, a real, warm, surprised laugh, and she felt it against her cheek where her face was pressed to his coat, and she thought she could become very attached to that sound. They stood there for a long time on the limestone shelf above the valley, and the sun moved west and the shadows lengthened across the pale grassland below, and by the time they rode back down to the valley floor, something had shifted in the air between them that would not shift back. The legal transfer of the water rights was completed in the second week of November, with Hartwell from Santa Fe presiding and Gilbert providing his official witness signature, and Daniel Crane accepting the document with the quiet, contained gravity of a man receiving something he had never quite stopped believing would be returned to him. Afterward, in the street outside the county clerk's office, Daniel shook Gilbert's hand and then turned to Ruby, and he said, "My brother is coming out in the spring. He wants to see the creek again, the one our father built. He is welcome," Ruby said. "There is a good house on the eastern edge of the old property. I will see that it is made available." Daniel nodded. Then he said something Ruby had not expected. "Our father used to talk about the woman who ran this valley. He said Thomas Mercer's daughter had more backbone than most men he knew, and that it was a shame what her father had done because the valley deserved her." He looked at her steadily. He was right. Ruby was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Please tell your brother he is welcome whenever he chooses to come. This valley is his as much as anyone's." Daniel tipped his hat, collected his horse, and rode east toward the hotel, and Ruby and Gilbert stood in the street in the November wind and watched him go. "That is one thing done," Gilbert said. "Yes. How do you feel?" She considered the question honestly. "Lighter," she said, "and very tired and hungry," he smiled. "Come on, I will buy you supper." They ate at the hotel dining room, which was the best the town of Harlow's Creek had to offer, which was not saying a great deal. But the beef was hot, and the bread was fresh, and the coffee was strong. And they sat across from each other in the warm lamplight and talked about nothing in particular and everything of consequence, the way two people talk when they have decided to stop holding back. He told her about growing up in Kansas, about his father who had been a homesteader and his mother who had taught school in the winter months, and kept the family fed in the lean years with a ferocity that he still considered the most impressive thing he had ever witnessed. He told her about coming west at 20, about the specific variety of young man's arrogance that had made him think he could wear a badge and make things right by force of will alone. He told her about the night in 1873 that he thought about more than any other single night in his life. Ruby told him about her mother, who had died when Ruby was 8 of a fever that came and went in 2 days and left Thomas Mercer bewildered and diminished, and never quite the man he had been before. She told him about learning cattle at 12, about a foreman named Santos who had worked the Mercer ranch for 15 years, and who was the person who had actually taught her what she knew, who had treated her as seriously as he would have treated a grown man, and who had been the most important teacher of her life. She told him about the year she was 18 and had wanted to leave to go east to study, to see something beyond the valley, and how she had looked at her father's failing health and the ranch that needed managing and had made the choice that she had never quite made peace with, even though she did not regret it. "Do you," Gilbert said, "still want to go east?" "Sometimes I want to see the ocean," she said. "I have read about it enough, but no, I do not want to leave this valley. It is mine." She paused. "It is mine in the right ways now. That matters." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. They had not done this in public before, had not done very much of anything in public, being two people who were instinctively private, and Ruby looked down at his hand on hers and then back up at his face and did not move her hand away. "It matters," he agreed. They went out into the cold night together, and their breath made small clouds in the November air, and he walked her to where her horse was hitched at the post outside and stood there in the dark street with her, neither of them quite ready to say good night. "I want to ask you something," Ruby said. "Ask." She looked at him very directly. "You are 44 years old and you have never married." "I am 30 years old and I have never married. We are both, apparently, too stubborn and too busy and too convinced that we could manage perfectly well on our own to do anything about the fact that we have been in love with each other for years." She paused. "I am done managing perfectly well on my own." His dark eyes were steady on her face. "What are you saying, Ruby?" "I am saying that I have had enough of being practical about everything except this. I am saying that the ranch is mine and my life is mine and I make my own decisions, and I am deciding that I want you in it, properly, permanently." She met his gaze without blinking. "I am saying that I am not asking you to court me anymore. I am asking you to marry me." The street was very quiet. A horse shifted at the hitching post. The saloon down the block was making its usual noise, music and voices and the occasional burst of laughter. Gilbert Haskins looked at Ruby Mercer in the dark of the November street, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a human being. "You are proposing to me," he said. "I have always done things in the most direct way available," she said. "And I am not going to change that now." He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and he cupped her face in both hands with a gentleness that she had not expected from those large, careful hands, and he said, "Yes, Ruby Mercer, yes, without a single reservation in the world." He kissed her there in the main street of Harlow's Creek, and if anyone passing by had opinions about it, neither of them noticed. They were married in December, on a cold, clear morning when the ground was silver with frost, and the cottonwoods along the river stood bare and silver-white against a sky of impossible blue. The wedding was small, the minister, Ruby's ranch foreman Santos and his wife, a handful of neighbors and town figures who had known them both for years, and Ruby wore her mother's dress, let out at the shoulders and taken in at the waist, because her mother had been shorter and broader and Ruby was taller and leaner, but the green fabric was the same green fabric, and wearing it felt like something more than sentiment. Gilbert stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him, and his expression was the one she was coming to think of as his real face, the open, unguarded one, the one that was not managing or measuring or protecting anything. And when she reached him and took his hands, he said, very quietly, so only she could hear it, "You are the most remarkable thing I have ever seen." She said, equally quietly, "You should see me negotiating a cattle contract sometime." He laughed, and the minister cleared his throat, and they were married. The winter was hard, as Cimarron winters tended to be, but the ranch was well prepared and the cattle losses were minimal, and Ruby spent the coldest months doing something she had not allowed herself much of in her adult life, which was being genuinely, uncomplainingly content. Gilbert moved into the ranch house, which required some reorganization of space and some negotiation of habits, because they were both people who had lived alone for a long time and had strong opinions about where things went. There was a week in January during which the arrangement of the kitchen shelves was a source of significant disagreement that finally ended with Ruby laughing until she had to sit down, which was enough of a resolution for both of them. He was a good man to share a house with. He was quiet in the mornings and talkative in the evenings, which suited her exactly the opposite direction, and they discovered that this was actually functional. She talked while she made coffee and he listened with one eye on the newspaper, and by supper he was ready to converse, and she was ready to listen, and they met in the middle of the day with a companionability that felt, to Ruby, like something she had not known she was missing. He was also, it turned out, genuinely helpful on the ranch, which she had not assumed, and which he had not offered in a way that suggested he expected to take over. He understood cattle and fencing and water management well enough to be useful, and not so much that he overstepped, and he continued his job as sheriff without reduction of attention. And on the evenings when she rode out to check on the far pastures, he sometimes rode with her, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with cattle or law or the past, and those rides became the part of her day she looked forward to most. In February, Daniel Crane's brother Samuel arrived in the valley, 3 weeks earlier than expected, with his wife and 2 young sons in a wagon packed for a longer stay than had been discussed. Daniel met him at the edge of the old property, and Ruby rode out to welcome them, bringing a hamper from the kitchen and the deed for the house on the eastern edge. And Samuel Crane stood in the cold February wind looking at the creek his father had built and cried without shame, his wife's hand in his. The Crane brothers began rebuilding their family's water operation in the spring, and Ruby negotiated with them, as equals, for the shared access her cattle needed, and the agreement they reached was fair to all parties and drew up a template for cooperative range management that other ranchers in the valley would eventually follow. It was the kind of thing that happened quietly, without ceremony, and that changed the landscape in ways that were more durable than anything that could have been achieved through courts or confrontation alone. Spring also brought the County Sheriff's Association review that Gilbert had been expecting since giving his sworn statement in the fall. 2 men rode down from the county seat in March with careful manners and a lot of documents, and spent a day in Gilbert's office going through everything. And at the end of it, they told him that given the passage of time and his voluntary disclosure and the positive resolution of the matter, there would be a notation in his record but no further action. Ruby was in the office when they told him this, sitting in the corner chair with her hands folded in her lap and her expression absolutely unreadable, the way it got when she was keeping a careful grip on what she wanted to say. After the association men left, Gilbert sat back in his chair and let out a very long breath. "Well," he said. "Well," Ruby agreed, "that could have been worse. Yes, it could have been significantly worse." She stood. "I should tell you that if they had acted differently, I had already arranged to discuss the matter with Congressman Halter's office. There are several things about the 1873 county process that would have been of interest to a federal inquiry, and the association knew it, and I wanted to make sure they knew that I knew it." Gilbert stared at her. "You had already arranged. I am not going to apologize for protecting what is mine," she said pleasantly. "You are mine, Gilbert. I protect what is mine." He was very quiet for a moment, and then he said, in a tone that she recognized as the one he used when he was doing his best not to smile, "Mrs. Haskins." "Sheriff Haskins," she returned. "Come here." She came around the desk, and he pulled her into his lap with a lack of ceremony that still occasionally surprised her, and she settled there with her arm around his neck and her cheek against his temple, and they sat together in the quiet office while the spring afternoon moved past outside, and everything was, in that moment, entirely all right. Summer came in with a rush of heat and growth, the valley going green in a way it had not been in several years, and the ranch was busy and profitable in ways that Ruby had rebuilt through careful management, And there were days when she rode the fence line in the morning sun and thought about her father and what he had done and what it had cost, and she did not arrive at peace with it, exactly. She was not sure she ever entirely would. But she arrived at a kind of settled, understanding that the past was a place you could acknowledge without living in. In July, Santos retired. He was 63 years old and his wife wanted to go live near their daughter in Taos. And he told Ruby on a Thursday morning with the directness of a man who has earned his directness. And Ruby thanked him with a comprehensiveness that made him look, for a moment, like he might become emotional, which he managed the way he managed most things, by turning quickly to look at something else until his face was composed again. She hired a new foreman named Elias Drum, who was 30, competent, and had worked 2 ranches in the Sangre de Cristo foothills. He was good with horses and excellent with cattle and slightly in awe of Ruby's operational knowledge, which she found practical rather than inconvenient. In August, she discovered she was expecting. She told Gilbert on a Friday evening. They were on the porch after supper, the way they often ended evenings when the weather was fine, sitting in the 2 chairs with their feet up on the rail and the moon rising over the bluffs to the east. She had been thinking about how to say it for 3 days and had concluded that there was no best way, only the direct way. "I am going to have a child," she said. He was looking at the moon. He went very still. "Gilbert." He turned to look at her and his face in the moonlight was doing something complex and unguarded and she watched it work through things she could not quite read. Then he said, Are you well? Are you? I am perfectly well. I am healthy and I am 30 years old and I have every reason to expect this to go normally." He reached for her hand, found it, held it. "Ruby, I know. A child." "A child," she confirmed. He lifted her hand and pressed it to his mouth and held it there, and she could feel him breathing, and she thought, "This is what it is. This is the thing you do not see coming and cannot prepare for and cannot manage with practicality. This is it." "I am," he said against her hand, "going to be someone's father. You are going to be excellent at it. How are you so certain of that? Because you are the most patient person I have ever known and you are not afraid of things that are larger than you and you listen when people talk and you know when to be quiet." She pulled her hand back and settled it in her lap. "Those are the most important things." He was quiet for a long moment looking at the moon. Then, "Boy or girl, I don't care. I only care that you are both well, as do I." They sat there in the warm August dark, and the moon climbed higher over the red bluffs, and somewhere in the cottonwoods along the river, something stirred and settled, and the valley was very still. Ruby's pregnancy was, as she had predicted, entirely normal and accomplished with the same matter-of-fact practicality she brought to everything, which did not mean it was without difficulty. The autumn was hard in the way that late pregnancy is hard. The fatigue and the weight and the increasing ungainliness of a body she had always relied on to do what she asked of it. And she continued working longer than most women would have, which Gilbert accepted without comment, because he understood by now that telling Ruby Mercer what to do with her own body was a category of error with no upside. He was, as she had predicted, excellent at it. Not in any dramatic or demonstrative way, but in the quiet, consistent way that characterized everything he did. He was simply there, reliably and without being asked, checking in without hovering, managing the gap between what she was willing to admit she needed and what she actually needed with a skill that she found both occasionally infuriating and deeply reassuring. In November, exactly a year after the water rights transfer, Ruby Mercer Haskins gave birth to a boy. They named him Thomas, which was her father's name, and which she chose not because she had made peace with everything her father had done, but because names can carry more than one thing, and she wanted this boy to carry the good parts too. The hard work and the love of the land and the determination that had built something real in a difficult place. Thomas came into the world on a cold, clear morning, wailing with considerable authority, and Gilbert held him in the doctor's office while the doctor attended to Ruby, and he looked at this small, outraged, perfect creature, and felt the particular terror and love of new parenthood hit him all at once like a physical force. Ruby reached for the baby almost immediately. She held him with the same matter-of-fact competence she brought to everything, examining him with the frank, assessing eye of a woman who was unintimidated by things that were unfamiliar. And then she looked up at Gilbert with something on her face that he had never seen before, a vulnerability that was also a completeness, a cracking open that was also a solidity. And she said, "Hello, Thomas." The winter was the warmest Gilbert could remember in 20 years in the valley. Not the weather was brutal, one of the hardest Januaries on record, but the house, which had been Ruby's father's house and then Ruby's house, and was now genuinely, completely theirs. A house where things happened and people lived and noise occurred, and there were no secrets living in the walls anymore. Thomas was a vigorous, opinionated baby who slept in intervals and demanded attention at irregular hours, and Ruby managed this with the organizational competence of someone scheduling a cattle drive. And Gilbert handled the overnight hours more often than not because he was a lighter sleeper, and because he had decided early on that any job connected to this child was a privilege and not a burden. Daniel Crane and his wife were their nearest neighbors now, having built a proper house on the old Crane homestead, and they came to see the baby in January and stayed for supper, and Ruby looked around her table at Gilbert and the Cranes and Elias, the new foreman who had been invited because Ruby felt a foreman's relationship to a household should be collegial, and thought about the extraordinary specificity of how people ended up in the same room together. What it took, what it cost, what it was worth. Spring came, and Thomas was 4 months old and already showing signs of his mother's intense observational focus, watching everything around him with enormous dark eyes and a concentration that struck everyone who met him as somehow elderly. One Saturday in May, Ruby rode out to the river lookout. She went alone, which she still did sometimes, needing the particular clarity that came from the height and the view and the absence of anyone else's needs in her immediate vicinity. Thomas was with Gilbert, who had become extraordinarily capable with the baby, and who was in no way inconvenienced by an afternoon of sole responsibility. She sat on the limestone shelf above the bend in the river and looked at the valley below, and she did the accounting that she sometimes needed to do, not the ranch's accounts, but the larger ones, the ones that lived in the chest rather than on paper. 20 years of a secret, buried and grown over and finally exhumed. A family wronged and imperfectly but genuinely acknowledged. A man who had made a mistake at 22 and spent 20 years trying to be something better and had mostly succeeded. A ranch that was smaller than it had been and more honest and more hers. A husband who listened and did not manage her and held the baby through the night and still looked at her the way he had looked at her in the firelight of their parlor on the evening she had told him she was done being practical about this. A son named Thomas, who was the most serious 4-month-old in the Cimarron Valley, and who would grow up knowing the full truth of his family's history, because his mother had decided that secrets were a weight she refused to pass on. She sat there for a long time in the May sunshine, and the valley below her was green and alive, and crossed by the silver lines of the Crane water system, which was flowing the way it had always been meant to flow. Then she heard hoofbeats behind her and turned to find Gilbert coming up the path, Thomas wrapped against his chest in the way he had worked out with the blanket and the shoulder strap that allowed him to ride short distances with the baby secure. "I thought you were staying at the house," she said. "I was." He dismounted, careful with the bundle against his chest, and came to sit beside her on the limestone. Thomas, undisturbed by the ride, was looking at the sky with his usual elderly gravity. He was awake, and I thought he might like to see this. Ruby looked at the baby, who was indeed looking at the valley below with an expression of focused contemplation that probably exceeded his intellectual capacity for the view but was entirely on brand for him. "He cannot see that far yet," she said. "He can see further than you think." Gilbert settled beside her, close, their shoulders touching, and he looked out at the valley with the same steadiness he brought to everything. "I come up here sometimes. Did you know that?" You do, since I was a deputy. When something is too large to think about from inside it, Ruby looked at him. And what do you think about when you come up here? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the spread of the valley. For 20 years, mostly about how to manage what I knew, how to keep the plates spinning without anything breaking. He paused. Now I come up here and I think about this. He indicated the view, the valley, her, the baby. About how things that seem impossibly tangled can come loose. About how long I lived in this valley believing I was alone with a burden, and how I was not alone and the burden was not mine alone to carry. Thomas made a small sound against his chest, one of his thinking sounds. He agrees, Ruby said. He has opinions about everything. He gets it from his mother. She leaned her head against Gilbert's shoulder, and he shifted his arm to accommodate her, and they sat together on the limestone shelf above the bend in the river, with the valley spread below them in the May sunlight, green and gold and crossed by silver water, and the baby between them considered the sky with his father's steadiness and his mother's intensity and a particular quality that was entirely his own. Gilbert, Ruby said. Yes. I want to go to the ocean sometime. He was quiet for a moment. The Pacific is about 1,000 miles west, he said thoughtfully. The Atlantic is about 1,500 miles east. I know, I am not asking to go tomorrow. Next summer, he said. We could take Thomas. He would have opinions about the ocean, I expect. She smiled against his shoulder. He would have extensive opinions about the ocean. We could take the train as far as it goes and ride from there. That is an entire trip to plan. We have time, Gilbert said. We have a great deal of time. She tilted her head up to look at him, and he looked down at her. And the afternoon light was doing the same unfair thing to the lines of his face that it had been doing since November of last year, and she thought, I will never stop noticing that. I will be 70 years old and standing next to this man, and I will still notice the specific way afternoon light looks on this face. Yes, she said, we do. He kissed her there on the limestone shelf, with Thomas observing them between them with what appeared to be mild philosophical interest. And the valley below was everything it had ever been and more than it had been, because it was honest now, and the things that had been hidden were in the open, and the water ran in the channels where it belonged, and the people who had been wronged had been heard, and the people who had done the wrong had been named. And the woman who had built her life on land she had not known, was stolen, had made it right at significant personal cost and without complaint, because she was Ruby Mercer Haskins, and she did not do things any other way. The summer came in warm and generous, the valley's grasses tall and the cattle fat with it, and Ruby rode the fence lines in the mornings and sat with the ranch accounts in the evenings and watched Thomas discover, with increasing astonishment and volume, the category of things that existed in the world. He found his voice properly at 6 months and used it with enthusiasm. He pulled himself upright against the porch railing at 9 months and surveyed the front yard of the ranch house with an expression of proprietary satisfaction that made Gilbert laugh out loud and Ruby cover her mouth to conceal her smile. In August, 1 year after she had first told him about the baby, she told him about the second one. They were in bed in the early morning before he had to be up for the day, and she was lying with her head on his chest, and she said, I believe Thomas is going to be a brother. She felt the change in his breathing. Then his arm tightened around her. Ruby. Again. That is generally how it works, yes. He turned his face into her hair. Are you? I am well. I am perfectly well, the same as last time. And I expect it will be the same as last time, and everything will be fine. He held her more tightly, and she let him, which was its own kind of eloquence from a woman who did not habitually let anyone hold on. The second one was a girl, born in the spring of the following year, and they named her Catherine, which had been Gilbert's mother's name, and which Ruby chose because it was strong and not pretty, by which she meant it did not depend on prettiness for its effect. Thomas, at 14 months, was wary of Catherine for approximately 4 days, and then became her most aggressive protector, which manifested as following her around whenever she was set on a blanket and producing concerned commentary whenever she made a sound that he did not recognize. Gilbert observed this with profound entertainment. Ruby observed it with the recognition that her son was very much his father's child. Daniel Crane's wife had a baby the following September, a girl named Miriam, and the two families celebrated together at a long table on the Crane property with food from both households and the particular warmth of people who have arrived, through difficulty and honesty and a certain amount of luck, at a place where they can sit together and mean it. Samuel Crane visited from Colorado again that autumn, and he and Ruby spent a morning walking the old water channels, and he talked about his father with the quiet, precise grief of someone who has had years to find the right container for his loss. He talked about Isaiah Crane's hands, which were the most capable hands Samuel had ever seen, which had built the water system that made the valley livable and which had been relearned in Colorado on different ground, and which Samuel had inherited enough of to build something solid of his own. "Your valley is good now," Samuel said before he left. "Not our valley, not my valley. Your valley, which was a gift, and Ruby received it as such." "Come back," she said. "Bring the family. Thomas wants to show someone his horse." Samuel Crane laughed, which transformed him, and promised to return in the spring, and went. The years in the Cimarron Valley moved the way good years do, with enough difficulty to be real and enough goodness to make the difficulty worth it, with change that happened in ways that were rarely dramatic from the inside but which, seen from a distance, described a direction. Gilbert served as sheriff for another 8 years after their marriage, and then at 52 he stepped aside for a younger man, and shifted to a role that nobody had a formal name for, but which amounted to being the person in the valley who knew the most about how things had worked for the past 30 years, and who was willing to share that knowledge without self-importance. Ruby ran the ranch and taught Thomas what she knew, which was considerable, and Thomas at 15 was already the kind of young man who listened more than he talked, and who had opinions about water management that occasionally surprised the older hands. And Catherine at 13 was forming opinions about absolutely everything with the intensity of someone who had been born into a family where opinions were taken seriously. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Gilbert took Ruby to the Pacific Ocean. They went by train to San Francisco, which was a city that startled them both with its noise and scale, and the particular smell of salt and industry and too many people in one place, and they stayed 4 days and walked the length of the waterfront, and Ruby stood at the edge of the continent with the Pacific in front of her and felt the wind come off the water, which was cold and smelled like nothing she had experienced, and she thought, "Here it is. Here is the thing I wondered about." "Well," Gilbert said. He was standing beside her, hands in his pockets, watching her face. "It is very large," she said. "It is the Pacific Ocean. I expected it to be large. I did not expect it to feel like this." She was quiet for a moment, "like something that has been here a very long time and does not require anything of you." "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." She took his hand, and they stood there at the edge of the continent with the Pacific coming in, and going out the way it had been doing since before any of the things that had happened in the Cimarron Valley were even possible to imagine. And the size of it was enormous and entirely indifferent, and Ruby found it, unexpectedly, a profound relief. They went home to the valley 2 weeks later, coming in from the east on the train and then by horse for the last 30 miles. And when the red bluffs appeared on the horizon and the cottonwood corridor along the river came into view, Ruby felt the particular settling that a person feels in the presence of the thing they are made for. Thomas met them at the road, 17 now, and managing the ranch with Santos-level competence, and Catherine was behind him on her horse, looking exasperated at being required to wait when she clearly wanted to be first. Gilbert swung down and caught her when she came off her horse at speed, which she still did at 13 and would probably do at 30, and she said, "How was the ocean?" And Gilbert said, "Very large," and she said, "I want to go," and he said, "Ask your mother," and Ruby said, without looking over, "Not until you are older," and Catherine made a sound of theatrical frustration that carried perfectly in the clear autumn air. They rode home in the long afternoon light, the four of them, through the valley that had been the setting of a hidden motive and a theft and a secret kept for 20 years, and a reckoning and a restoration, and a marriage and 2 children, and a water system working the way its builder had intended, and a family on the far side of a wrong that had been named and partially repaired. And Ruby rode in the middle of the group with her husband on one side and her children quarreling cheerfully on the other, and looked at the valley in the October light and thought about what it meant to make something yours the right way. It meant knowing what it cost. It meant knowing what had been done before you arrived, and what it had taken to build what you had and what you owed for it. It meant being willing to lose something to keep your own integrity intact, and finding that what you kept was worth more than what you gave up. It meant telling the truth when the truth was difficult and staying when leaving would have been easier, and choosing, every day, to see the people around you clearly rather than conveniently. She looked at Gilbert riding beside her, and he caught her eye and gave her the smile, the real one, the one that was not managing or measuring anything, and she thought, 20 years somebody kept a secret that should not have been kept, and from the unraveling of that secret improbably this family, this valley, this life. The ranch house appeared at the end of the road, and the lamp was lit in the front window because Thomas had ridden ahead to light it, because he was that kind of thoughtful, and the smoke was going from the chimney because he had thought to build the fire before he came to meet them, and Ruby thought, there it is. There is the foundation. Not the one her father built, not the one she had inherited without knowing what was beneath it, but the one she had rebuilt, stone by stone, in full knowledge of what had been there before. They went inside, all 4 of them, and the house was warm and lit and full of the ordinary business of a family coming home, and Gilbert took her coat and hung it by the door, and Thomas went to see about the horses, and Catherine was already at the kitchen table with a book and a running commentary about whether they had missed anything important while they were gone, and the answer was no, nothing was missed, nothing was lost, everything was where it belonged, everything was finally, completely, entirely right. Ruby Mercer Haskins stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the parlor, and she listened to her daughter describe the 3 things that had happened in the valley while they were away, and she watched her husband pour coffee at the stove with the ease of a man entirely at home in his own kitchen, and she let herself have it, the fullness of it, the completeness of it, the thing she had spent 30 years becoming practical enough not to need, and had finally stopped pretending not to want. The secret was in the open now, and the wrong was named, and the land was honest, and the water ran where it should, and the family that had been dispossessed had come back to their ground. And nobody in the valley knew the half of what it had taken to get here, but Ruby knew, and Gilbert knew, and that, between the 2 of them, was more than enough.